We better begin. A new subject matter, and it will take us some days, perhaps 2 or 3, or I don't know, 4, to finish the outline of what Sri Aurobindo thinks about and has said about poetry. But first, before we begin, we can have this question put to us because many people have this question in this age, which is itself not poetic. What has spirituality to do with poetry? Just as many people think, what has collective life to do with with Aurobindo spirituality? Well, what has poetry to do with spirituality? And there, perhaps, I think it is uh, necessary to point out the connection that poetry is a spontaneous activity of man in his cultural life. And so before I launch on the subject proper, Sri Aurobindo himself has devoted a good deal of his energy to the creation of poetry, to the understanding of poetry, and to also outlining the possible future line of development of poetic spirit of man. He has written 2 volumes of collected poems. He has written 2 epics, one on Indian subject Savitri, another on the Greek subject of Homer's Iliad, pulling from the end of Homer to further up. Ilion deals with the European subject, Greek subject, and also experiments on new form of poetry, quantitative meter. You see, it is a long essay of 60 pages in which he makes out a case for introducing a new value of vowel content in the foot measure of English poetry. The general way in which the foot was measured till yesterday, because nowadays perhaps they don't care for foot measure or anything, poetry being free. But he introduced this element that if a new form was to be created, there was ample room for experiments in not taking the classical foot measure of vowel content in poetry. The dictionary, content of food or stress in English is not the same that is given by actual speech. Actual speech and dictionary accent differ in the content of vowel. And he showed that if actual spoken speech is taken and the vowel content measured, then perhaps there will be a very great free variation for creating new forms of poetry, even pentameter, hexameter, and so on. He himself has written this Ilion in hexameter, 5,000 lines. I think that's the only longest poetry in hexameter in English. And that is one that can be said to succeed because the other examiners that have been tried by Swinburne and other poets have not come to that degree of success in giving variation. You see, in the hexameter because it falls flat afterwards. So after 100 lines or 200 lines, it falls flat because of the regularity of the rhythm in the hexameter. Whereas here, due to the variation of his quantitative meter, original contribution of his in the quantitative meter, well, it retains its form to the last. But these are his last poems also are there. Some of the lyrics are there, which are quite new attempts in English poetic form. But it is because this yoga is intimately connected with the whole field of life. It does not neglect any field of life. And poetry being an important cultural activity of the whole collective life of man also and of the individual, well, naturally, the source of poetry, the value of poetry, the place of poetry in life, and as an indication of the movement of the human soul. You see, as a field of experience for human consciousness, poetry offers a field, and in that field, what is possible to know, what is possible to see, and whether there are any indications that show that man has in his psychological makeup elements which have not yet fully tapped, potentialities which are, well, operating now and then under certain stress of circumstance, under experience, under some pressure, under some intensity of experience, or under special conditions of inner and outer life, those faculties operate, you see. And his purpose is to see how the analysis of the creative faculty of poetry can give us some indication of the constitution of man and indicate the future line of his progress. Does it indicate any future line of progress? That is how yoga being connected with bringing into experience, field of experience, the powers or planes of consciousness which man normally doesn't contact. Well, poetry might offer a ground of activity where the human spirit would be able to know that other planes of consciousness than what normally act are available to him. That's one. And if he can make the conscious not accidental, not due to environmental or to certain intense states of experience, but normally, then it would be possible for man to make a normal ascent to those planes of consciousness from where he can bring down or he can receive poetic or artistic creations. That would be one advantage to mankind if that could come to pass. Now, what are the faculties that operate in the creation of poetry? We're trying to see that. Pure intellect is supposed to create poetry by some people. But Sri Aurobindo says in his future poetry, he has written a book on new line of criticism of English poetry has been written by him. The title of the book is Future Poetry. And that is inaugurating a new line of criticism. Now, therein he says that pure intellect cannot create poetry. Even when reason participates in creating poetry, it is inspired reason and not ordinary logical cold reason. That is one. Then who creates? According to him, the true creator is the soul. That is how he puts it in the future poetry. But we know that people believe that imagination is the faculty of creating poetry. And what is imagination? If you take imagination as the faculty that creates poetry, well, imagination is the faculty to conceive something impossible, perhaps, something illogical, something bizarre, something fantastic. That is what people think when they think of imagination. They think that you sit down and have idle dreams, something that does not happen on the physical plane. You imagine, and that is imagination. He doesn't believe that imagination is so wavered a faculty, only it doesn't operate according to logic, according to reason. That's why people do not think of it as a power that can hit the truth. In fact, imagination has very often hit the truth. It is by imagination that one feels the reality in advance of the times or advance of his experience. Jules Verne gave expression to that power of imagination in the scientific world. And he saw 80 years before all the scientific progress that have been achieved by man. It was imagination going forward, so to say, and trying to envisage the reality. It may not get the correct picture of the reality or even at all touch the reality because it might go away at a tangent, touching some possibility, something that can happen but doesn't happen. So that when imagination goes wrong, it is not because it's a wrong faculty, but it doesn't hit the mark. It takes out of 20 possibilities, it hits upon one. Another imagination hits upon another. Only some that is guided by the inner spirit, well, goes straight to the mark. And then imagination is a faculty that hits the reality, hits the truth in advance of its appearance in life. That is what imagination really is. Now, as for imagination, or rather imaginative intelligence, Sri Aurobindo says in his Savitri, he has quoted some poem, poetic expression of what he believes to be imagination. Imagination called her shining squads I'm quoting his poetic expression of what he understands by imagination. Imagination called her shining squads that venture into undiscovered scenes, where all the marvels lurk none yet has known, lifting her beautiful and miraculous head, imagination. She conspired with inspiration's sister brood to fill thought's skies with glimmering nebulae. Imagination fills the skies of the mind, thought's sky, with glimmering nebulae. Nebulae is shining nebulae. Yes, you don't hit correctly, you don't have complete contour, contour of the thing, but you get something very shining and wonderful. Or in another passage in Savitri, he says, imagination's comet tale of dreams. Imagination's comet tale of dreams took now a closer shape of reality. It was a comet tail, but it became a sharp image of a reality slowly when it was put down into the vision. Well, it became reality. Ignorance was a thin shade protecting light. Imagination, the free will of the truth. Imagination is the free will of the truth. Free will of the truth. Yes. When truth is allowed his free will to exercise, well, man feels it as imagination, that's all. Imagination, the free will of the truth. And then he compares imagination to a magician, you see. Imagination is like a magician in mind of man. Reason is not able to do anything. Imagination comes like a magician and shakes the wand and something comes out. So at one place he says, imagination's great unsorceling rod summoned the unknown and gave to it a home, outspread luxuriously in golden air. Truth's irised colored ways of fantasy, or sang to the intuitive heart of joy, wonders his dream notes that bring the real close. That bring the real close. So it gives some idea that imagination is a faculty in the consciousness of man which can and does very often hit the truth. Uh, that's the general idea. Then she says, what's the power by which, beyond imagination, what is the other faculty? Inspired reason is one power, imagination is another power. You can say imaginative intelligence if you like. The third power by which poet creates is power of vision, which is different from imagination. Vision is the sight of the reality. Is the sight of the reality. The power by which the poet creates is the power of vision, he says in future poetry. And vision is the characteristic power of the poet, as is discriminative thought, the essential gift of the philosopher, and analytical observation, the natural genius of the scientist. The scientist has analytical observation, the philosophic mind or the thought mind has got discriminative thought, where the poet has power of vision. That is his power. We'll say, but what is vision? When you say vision, it smacks of something that you might say is something that is not very clear. So we'll take his idea of what is vision. The poetic vision may be of anything in nature or God or man or life of creatures or the life of things. It may be a vision of force and action or of sensible beauty or of truth of thought or of emotion and pleasure and pain of this life or the life beyond. It is sufficient that the soul sees. What is required in a vision is that the soul must see the vision, and the eye, sense, and heart and thought mind become passive instruments of the soul. then we get the real and high poetry. There you get some idea of vision. That's the idea of vision in poetry. The faculties thus that are involved and that evoke the poetic creation reveal the less known fields of human psychology. You can see that these are fields, exercise of inspired reason or imagination or vision, they are fields of human psychology which are not trodden, and not normal. At any rate, less known fields of human psychology. And as poetry has its repercussions on individual and collective life, poetry acts on life. Individual life is very often changed and molded. Not only individual but collective life, life of the nation, life of society, life of community is strongly influenced by poetry. So that it opens out to the human consciousness a field or a plane of experience which has a power of changing life. It's not merely expression which is neutral and abstract and stays in the air. It takes hold of the individual life, takes hold of sometimes, not every day, but collective life is powerfully influenced by the poetic expression, the genius of the times, you see, so that it is a source of, a creative power which changes the human life individually and influences powerfully the collective life of man. That's one part of poetry's contribution. And it's a power of epics, for instance, on the march of humanity towards pro-culture is very much marked. You see, the characters that are created, I mean the archetypes or archetypes as you call it, archetypes of the nation or the race that find expression in epic poetry, mold the life of generations of people. It's not merely that it remains in the books. You see, the Indian epics or the European epics, for the matter of that, have strongly influenced the life of thousands of persons for hundreds of years. You see, Ramayana and Mahabharata have been, molding generations of Indians in the mold of humanity, conceived and put forth in the poetry. So has the epics of the other languages. I am perfectly sure, because if epic is a living expression of the racial soul, naturally it goes on influencing consciously or subconsciously the life of people, you see, communities and succession of generations. Therefore, yes. Yoga attempts to awaken in man the dormant potentialities of his consciousness, and poetry also activates these very higher realms of man's consciousness. Therefore, you see, there is a relation between the two, and these experiences of these realms can change life of people and nations. And Sri Aurobindo therefore gives a high place as a movement of human soul and as a cultural activity of mankind. That is the place of poetry. Now we come to the place where we have to take count of modern life. Ours is a scientific age, and economy dominates our life of the individual and also the community, and it is the practical reason that also governs the mentality of the effective mentality of today. Such periods are fruitful in philosophy and criticism, but they do not create anything great. They are good for critical faculty, perhaps some philosophical thought, but such periods in which economy dominates and the practical reason of mind is his highest faculty, they are very, very poor in creativity. They don't create greatly. Poetry today is not one of the molding influences in life, chief molding influences at any rate. It is, as Sri Aurobindo calls it, an aesthetic byplay. He calls in his future poetry. Today, poetry is an aesthetic byplay in the cultural life of the race, not a leading force. And the two world wars have brought in their train disillusionment and frustration, and there is general all-round lowering of the values of life. This is very clear. And yet we must also admit that man's mind today thinks more, is more curious, many-sided, all-inclusive than the mind of man at any other time in his previous history. Therefore, an effort will be made here to present Sri Aurobindo's reading about the future poetry based mainly on his book, The Future Poetry. You see, he says in that book, I am quoting, poetry, like everything else in man, evolves. Its fundamental function and law are no doubt always the same. But still, there is an evolution within this law of its being. And evolution means bringing out new powers which lay concealed in the seed or the first form. Now that, you see, what power is lying in the poetic creation of man trying to find expression? You see, well, that is what we are trying to study now. His reading of the possible lines of future development of poetry is given subject to the fact that poetry is an unpredictable power. It is true that poetry cannot be reduced to a rigid and mechanical process or mechanical system, nor is it intended in this study to do so. It is intended to indicate broad lines of possible development, especially of the psychological factors involved, based on a study of the past. Poetry is a psychological phenomenon, and its evolution means primarily the evolution of the psychological motive and power behind poetry. The kind of mentality, feeling, vision, seeking expression in poetry constitutes the element of primary importance in the evolution of poetry. The technique, form, language, structure, that is body of poetry, of secondary importance. We are not interested in the technique, form, outer structure. No, we are concerned mainly with the psychological factors, mind, the feeling, the vision. What is it that is trying to seek expression in poetry? Poetry has been a constant cultural activity of the human spirit, and viewed on a large canvas of time, it can reveal the line of its evolution. If you take a large span of time, 2000 years or 1000 years, you can see or try to see what is the line of evolution that it is pursuing or that is being expressed through the poetic expression. Though it may start from any of the natural instruments, intellect, emotion, or passion, sensation, poetry can start from any point of experience. It can be intellect, it can be emotion, it can be passion, it can be sensation. Any experience of life is enough to start poetry. You see, it's only an excuse for creation. Really speaking, the outer irritation or outer sensation or impact is only an excuse for the inner creator to set to work. That's all. One man goes out and sees a natural landscape. Well, the beauty of the landscape or the color scheme or its, the grandeur, or you can say, it strikes him when it becomes. He meets with some pleasant experience in life or a joy. Well, immediately it becomes an expression, occasion for expressing something. Or he meets in something sad and, catastrophe. Well, that becomes. It is not that this is only a starting point, really speaking. What he arrives as is not expression of his individual experience, really speaking, but his perception of something much more than the individual experience. He is not expressing himself only, which is the modern people's craze, you see. Even when it is most personal, it expresses something most universal. You see, well, that if he the point of departure for creation is only an excuse. It's only like starting away the current of electricity by an accidental contact. The accidental contact is not responsible for creating the current. You see. Anyway, yeah. It is the deepest origin, a power of the soul, the true being in man. Poetic vision follows the evolution of the human spirit through outward consciousness. In the beginning, man's mind turns to the physical world which is around him. to life and to outward action. That is, man when he begins, you see, when the mind turns outward. The poet takes hold of this material, casts it into the mold of his own thought or religious idea, because in the beginning, man's whole conception of life is the whole life is conceived in mold of religious life. You see, it is a religious mold of life in the primitive state, at least in when society starts. So it takes hold of the material, casts it into the mold of his thought or mold of his religious idea in which he is living, in which the whole society is living at that time, some conception of reality. And he may see into these outer things, objects of nature or his experience, action, physical world, he may see into these things some spiritual truths. It may be a presence, like the primitive man in Africa, he felt a spirit. He felt something which is supraphysical. But he wants to see, primarily turns his gaze to the outer world, physical world, nature, experience, and then through these outer things he sees some spiritual truths. Even this inner truth, the spiritual reality, expresses in forms and figures of physical life. He's not able to give it a an expression which can intellectual. No, it's not intellectual. He expresses it also in terms of the physical world, outer world, or symbols, concrete forms, not abstract ideas. You see, well, Vedic poetry furnishes an example of this type, where the seer contacts the outer form and goes behind and sees the spirit and expresses it in symbolic language. The poetic vision, even in those early days or early times, sees and discloses divine qualities even in obvious and most external things. It feels when water flows. He cannot look at it that it must flow. To him, it is something that he has to understand. The fact of water flowing requires to him an explanation, and he is not able to explain it to himself, like a modern scientist who believes that because he has some kind of material explanation, therefore understands why water flows. He does not. But he believes that now he knows something of how it happens, and the mystery is gone for him. But to the man who first feels that the striking of fire from two pieces of wood is something very mysterious and wonderful. The presence of fire is there, he knows, in the wood. And yet he is not able to see it. You see, that's how he feels. And any man with a common idea of what is truth or reality would feel the same. But modern man doesn't feel, because he thinks, oh, I can produce by striking a match. That's all right for getting of fire, but the creation of fire was the greatest discovery in mankind. You must remember. So, and those people, when they discovered the fire, they were struck by the wonder of the phenomenon, the sublimity of what was around them. You see, that water can flow and flow and flow and never stop. That sun can go on rising, rising, and regularly every day. This is not small thing, but well, we have lost the sense of wonder. That's all. And here, in the external thing, in objects and in the actions of man, they saw, you see, qualities and presences and powers. In this delineation of human personality, also it is the outer being, the extraordinary physical prowess and powers that the poet sees and renders. A hero in the early, epic is somebody who can put down 1,000 men without any difficulty. I mean, you see, he endows it with that divine quality. But behind the outer appearances is also powers of gods working in the outer human situation. You can say Homer represents this kind of poetic vision. He represents the battlefield not as merely a field contrived or created by or brought about by human agencies. He knows that behind this play of, the warriors and fighting this whole field, there are divine powers that are working. You see, Zeus and the three powers of, Venus and Minerva and so on. You find that it is they who are really working behind the mentality of the warriors, so that humanity is not left to itself, so to say, which is now the case that we are matter only and we should try to become matter. Why not? Well, it's all right. You can become matter because you are matter in one part of your being. Only thing is that you are not only matter because matter is not your only constituent. But modern mind refuses stoutly that why should I take anything for granted? Well, even matter you take for granted because matter also you do not know what it is. Matter is not known, matter is assumed. You say this is matter, but what is matter is not known even to the best scientist today. Well, but he thinks that now I know something about the processes of matter and therefore, well, I will start only that I am matter. So the mind is matter. Then poetry is also a creation out of matter. So if you know all the causes, they would argue, all the factors that operate, you can at will create a Shakespeare. You can at will create a Christ. I don't know, but this is a logical conclusion about which they are actually arguing. In a dark valley of tremendous ignorance, they are trying to be very intelligent by arguing that if we know all the factors, of course there is a big if, but if we know all the factors, we can, of course we can. Only up till now we don't know the factors, and I know that at end of time you will never know the factors unless you admit that man is not only matter. Then you will know, or you might come to know some factors. It's not easy. It's all right theoretically to argue that if I know all the factors, I can create a Shakespeare. Of course you can. But there is only one Shakespeare, unfortunately, in the world. And all combinations of protoplasm and the what is called the genes and the action of the gene and the protoplasm, if it was thoroughly known and controlled, you can create a Christ. I hope you do. That's all the difficulties, but it's far way to go that way, I mean. Now you can say that Homer is representing that period. From the physical plane, the poetic vision sees the passion, surge, and power of life, its joy and sorrow, pain and wonder, terror and beauty, hope and despair, pride and love and hate, jealousy and romance. It turns everything to moved thought, not merely thought, not dry thought. Moved thought charged with emotion, sentiment or sensation of life's soul. Whatever thought element is present is not calm light of reason or thought moving in its own sovereign right, but thought arising out of life. That is how you have to see the phase that we talked about as Homer's phase. The third phase is that of intellectual vision. Mind is the chief faculty of man, and the human spirit cannot be permanently held in life force, confined to its vital being. Mind may be interested in life, but mind wants to function independently. Intellect of man, mind of man may be interested in life, but intellect wants to function independently. It wants to see, to observe, to know, to master. It wants to see everything with the calm eye of reason. It wants to analyze, find out the cause. It wants to logicize, to get at the law of things. When poetry is dominated by this rational view, then we have lucid, restrained intellectual creation. What is called classical, you see. Poetry acquires then a classical form. Ideas govern its movement. Ideas govern the movement, you see. And even when it deals with life, it does so in an atmosphere of rational beauty. Well, Greek and Latin poetry is typical of this strain. Now, now we take a further subject, you see. In order to illustrate this process of evolution of poetry, this is rough idea which I planned before you, but Sri Aurobindo takes English poetry because English poetry, according to him, is, quoting, most rich and powerful, lavish of energy and innate genius. Other poetic literatures like those of Greek or Latin or Sanskrit have not had the same opportunity to pursue an uninterrupted, even course of evolution like English. They were always, interrupted by historical, factors, revolutions, and changes of dynasty and changes of standards of life and so on. England being isolated in a, island, when it began its poetry, well, the beginning also was without any tradition to lead her, and it began like a tabula rasa, like a blank. And then when it began, its course was left uninterrupted for about 1,000 years. You see, and that has given some chance to see an uninterrupted course of development of poetic genius in mankind. Of course, it's a particular race, English, but still, it gives us some general idea of the poetic faculty going from one phase to another to see what would be the lines. You see, we are trying to see. The religious, intellectual, and spiritual or other motives have been already active in those other languages, Greek and Sanskrit and Latin. Whereas in English, it is possible to follow the art evolution. Because there is no religious motive with which it starts, you see. It is not a description of the gods with which it begins with man. And it's possible to follow so far as poetry is concerned, English have not evolved a view of life which can be said to express a spiritual attitude. In fact, he says, the imaginative force in English poetry exceeds its thought power. The power of thought is not as great as the power of imagination. Another advantage is that it is shackled by no tradition, as classical tongues were, bound. The individual is entirely free in English poetry to create as he likes. And it's the individual who creates in entire freedom from any tradition. The progress of poetry in England, therefore, is the history of individual achievement. About the changes that have taken place, he says, now in quotation, the revolutions of the spirit of English poetry are an astounding decisiveness, are of an astounding decisiveness and abrupt. It began by a quite external and a clear and superficial substance and utterance. That was the work of Chaucer. Chaucer began by an external, a clear and superficial substance of utterance. You see, Canterbury Tales, is it not? Yes. A description of people going and human life and nature and people stopping and attitudes of people and so on, charged with some power of imagination, yes. It marks itself all by an abrupt exhaustion and cessation. Suddenly it comes to an end simply. It comes to an end, you see, it marks itself off by an abrupt exhaustion and cessation. Comes suddenly to an end. After Chaucer, you find, yes, something is there, but it comes to an end. Well, then in the Elizabethan period, English poetry proceeded to a deeper vital poetry. A poetry of power and beauty and wonder and spontaneous thought. The joy and passion and pain. The color and music of life, in which the external presentation of life and things was taken up, what Chaucer did, but exceeded, but it goes beyond what Chaucer did, but exceeded and given its full dynamic and imaginative content. The magnificent Elizabethan outburst, therefore, has another motive, spirit and manner of expression, which seems to have nothing to do with the past. It is self-born and under impulse of a new age and environment. As this period dies away, we have the lonely figure of Milton. After Elizabeth, you come to the lonely figure of Milton with his strenuous effort at the intellectual poetry, cast in the type of the ancients. Yes. The age which succeeds is that of a trivial intellectuality after Milton, which does not follow the lead of Milton, and is exact contrary of the Elizabethan form and spirit in the thin and arid reign of Pope and Dryden. You come to the age of Pope and Dryden after Milton, you see, where both the intellectuality of Milton and the outburst of life force in Elizabethan period is changed completely into what is called the arid reign of Pope and Dryden. After that, it turned to an attempt at mastering the secret of the Latins, secret of the clear and measured and intellectual dealing with life, things, and idea. And then you come to Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, and others. In them came an attempt, a brilliant and beautiful attempt, to get through nature and thought and the mentality in life and nature and their profounder aesthetic suggestion to certain spiritual truths behind them. There you find the first time what he calls the poets of the dawn, you see. This attempt of these poets, they are called by Sri Aurobindo poets of the dawn, could not come to perfect fruition. It was not allowed to come to its fullest, ripening. It did not ripen into perfect fruition. Partly because there had not been the right intellectual preparation or a sufficient basis of spiritual knowledge and experience, and only so much could be given as the solitary individual intuition of the poet could, by a sovereign effort, attain. Partly because, after the lapse into an age of reason, the spontaneous or the intenser language of spiritual poetry could not always be found. Or, if it was found, it could not be securely kept. So, in the Victorians, after the poets of the dawn, we get a deviation into another age of intellectual, artistic, or reflective poetry with a much wider range, but less profound in its roots, less high in its growth, and partly out of this, partly by the recoil from it, has come the turn of recent contemporary poetry, which seems at last to be approaching the secret of the utterance of profounder truths with its right magic of speech and rhythm. He says in one of his writings, I believe it is Future Poetry, the progress of yes, yes, the yes, the progress of poetry has been an index of the advance of the cultured mind of humanity, which has enlarged its scope by a constant raising of the scale of soul's experience and has now risen to a great height and breadth of intellectual vision and activity. And the question is at present of the next step in the scale of ascension, and whether it can now be firmly taken or will be missed once more with a fall back to another retracing of psychological circuit. This is the problem. This he quotes I've quoted from Future Poetry. The problem is, you see, in the poets of the dawn, there was the soul breaking out into expression, and bringing into poetic expression spiritual reality, spiritual truths, poetically expressed. Then it was missed again, falling back to Victorian era. Now is again a time where there is a broadening out of the outlook. And whether the soul of man will, in poetic creation, rise to that ascent where it can enlarge the realm of spiritual experience, or whether again fall back to dry intellectuality. That is a problem today, you see. There are only two possibilities before poetry today. Either, first, to make an ascent to a higher level than mind, and thus raise the scale of the soul's experience, or to go on spinning in intellectual circles, or even to collapse to lower levels of intellectualized barbarism. That is from future poetry, you see. And in fact, some poetry is actually sinking to this level, you can see. Said it's not necessarily that a human being or human spirit would catch the opportunity and rise to the possible height. It might spin in intellectual circles, which some poetry is actually doing today. And there are also poets who have collapsed to the lower level of subconscious, giving rise to impulses which are common with the insect and the animal world, and they think that because it is new expression, it is something marvelous, which it is not. It is falling back, you see, into intellectualized barbarism. In some works of the school of modernist painting and poetry, these latter tendencies are visible. They fall back. But Aurobindo does not believe that the present period would end in a decadence. Well, he is hopeful and optimistic. He gives 3 or 4 reasons for this optimism. 1. There must be a change in the basis of poet's art first. When there is a substantial change in the constituting spirit and motive. The motive and spirit of poetic creation has changed. Therefore, there must be a change in his art. When there is a substantial change in the constituting spirit and motive. The motive and spirit of poetic creation has changed. Therefore, there must be a change in his art. What man is seeking or poet is seeking today is a change in the outer form because the change in the motive force has taken place. The motive of creative poetry has changed from what it was before. Therefore, the poet is seeking a change in the outer form. Accordingly, we find the beginnings of another spirit and motive in modern poetry. It manifests itself in the feeling of inadequacy of old rhythms. All poets find that old rhythms are not sufficient to serve their purpose. Old forms of prosody or old poetic forms are lyric is there, the pentameter, hexameter, all they are worked out, and they don't feel it's inadequacy of the old rhythms. In the old rhythm there is a march, a walk, or a lilt, a measured flow, roll, or a surge. And in less competent metrists, well, it becomes a tripping, trot, a dance and a gallop. This rhythmic change is subtle, you see, and it indicates a change in language and in poetic style. In the new movement, there is an insistence on tone, not so much insistence on fall. You see, a count of the outer rhythm of foot measure or prosody. The poet seems to want free room for his tone. The tone, you see. For instance, an intonation indicates some beginning. This insistence on the part of the poet on tone or intonation indicates some beginning of the direct spiritual intonation. He wants to introduce a new tone. And this new tone might be, he's seeking for the soul intonation, you see. This training for a new power of rhythm in its course gave us irregular meters, and at its culmination, free verse. You know, vers libre, as you call it in French, you see, free verse. For some times, even a theory was held that free verse was the only future form of poetry. This was once held, I don't think now. Even the great creators like Whitman and Carpenter, well, in their case, free verse is not successful as a form. That rhythm cannot be lightly dispensed with from poetry is seen easily in the case of Whitman, the avowed opponent of all meter, who, when he reaches the height of his creative moment, spontaneously falls into a rhythm, not an orthodox rhythm, but a rhythm all the same. You see, when Walt Whitman comes to the height of his expression, he doesn't believe in rhythm. In fact, he's avowed enemy of rhythm, and still, what he creates well falls into a rhythm. This journalist can scan some of his things and well, in some of his writings, in letters on literature. They scanned the writings of some of the poems of Whitman and showed that it is rhythmic. It's not orthodox rhyme or orthodox rhythm, but it is certainly rhythm. The only means that the new discovery is essential. It only means that a new discovery is necessary or essential, for the old rhythms would not embody the new spirit. Within the principle of inner rhythm, the essential rhythm is not outer but inner, or if you like to call it soul rhythm. The blank verse of Stephen Phillips, for instance, we find this insistence on the tone and the working of the principle of free intonation. Stephen Phillips, is not a well-known poet, you must remember, you see, but he is a characteristic poet in the sense that some of the new elements are very prominent in his small amount of writing. His writing is not voluminous, but it is indicative of the new turn that is coming in poetry through insistence on the tone. Meredith keeps a metrical law, but he gives occasionally a curious turn to the beat, which compels it to serve some dominant soul tone of thought and seeing. In Yeats, this spiritual intonation is the very secret of all his subtlest melodies and harmonies, and reveals itself whether in the use of old and common meters or in delicate new turns of his verse. William Butler Yeats. The poet must seize some sound, some intonation of the voice of the soul, the lyric or epic chanda as we call it, the rhythm. This intoned music in which the outer form becomes an external subtle means and suggestion, but the building power is other. Building power is inner. It opens at least one line on which we can arrive at a greater hearing whose wave can bring with it the inspiring word of a higher rhythm from the subtler worlds. That is to say, if this rhythm persists, if this attempt of the poetic new spirit persists, then slowly there will be felt a necessity of an intonation which comes from the deepest soul of the creator. This is bound to come sometime in the poetry if the spirit of creation that is at work in poets well is faithful to the call that is upon it. You see, if it remains faithful to the call, well, it will certainly rise to this new poetic form, which will be intonation of the soul. It will come from within, bearing its own rhythm, bearing its own the vibration, so to say, will not belong to the mind only, or to the sense, or to the imagination. Sri Aurobindo calls Wordsworth, Byron, Coleridge, Blake, Shelley, and Keats the poets of the dawn. These are the poets of the dawn. Yes, he gives Wordsworth, Byron, Coleridge, Blake, Shelley, and Keats. These are the poets of the dawn. Yes, dawn of poetry creation. Yes, that's real. In them, the spirit is dawning. That is to say, dawn in the sense of not that poetry began with them, no, but in them, the inner spirit has first tried to come into expression. You see, the soul has sought expression in these poets. You see, they have a greater thing to reveal than the Elizabethans. You can't doubt that, I suppose. Anyone who has read, as I have read, you see. Though they have not the constant fullness of the Elizabethan greatness, they are not full bodied in life force as the Elizabethans are, but they have certainly a greater thing to reveal. The thing that they reveal is far greater than certainly you can take the Elizabethan period, it is highest in Shakespeare, and you can see that the flight of the human spirit in these is certainly greater than Shakespearean flight. Shakespearean is rich in life content, powerful, strong, vivid, and life can rise to something great in thought, great in vision, as far as life can rise. But here it seems that what they want to say is something absolutely different in the way of human spirit and its expression. The feeling and the way in which it comes out in these poems, the spirit which they brought to their work was so new that the critics even didn't know what had come. I am quoting Sharundo, you see. Even critics did not know what has happened, what came, for they were burdened down by intellectualism. Of course, intellectuality was the burden of the times, and critics were baffled. They didn't know what had arrived in poetical creation. In this dawn, the poet wants to render the truth of the spirit by passing behind the appearances of the sense. He is attempting a work for which the power of the language is not quite prepared, except this symbolic approach, you see. These, they are poets of the dawn of the future poetry. They create out of some demon within them. Though the language which they use is highly intellectualized. In the poets of the dawn, there is not merely the spirit of life, but a greater spirit that embraces life. A greater spirit that embraces the whole of life. They don't reject life either. You see, there are magical first indications in Wordsworth and Keats, and in more recent work of Meredith and Stephen Phillips, A. and Yeats. Magical first indications of the coming dawn. Yes. These poets of the dawn derive their inspiration from some deeper and higher source. The soul gazes upon life and nature through poetical intelligence and imagination, but it is the soul that sees. There is a thirst in them for the spirit, an aspiration for ideal truth of being, a soul cry for perfection of the race. You never find that in Shakespeare. This spirit is seen through transcendentalism, or through the vision of the occult or psychic worlds behind the visible, or through the vision of a free world or a world of beauty. Now they feel freedom of man, the drive of love to its absoluteness, the democratic spirit rendered in terms of its spirituality. You see, you find that cry in Prometheus Unbound. You see, you feel the human spirit shackled by limitations of his body and life and desires and so on, seeking and feeling the need of that freedom. That aspiration is there. Some critics class Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, and Byron among romantists. You see, romantics, you can say. But though they have certain elements of romanticism in a broad sense, they fall outside in many respects, outside the field of romantics. You see, the romantics. Wordsworth had in his works the force of ethical thought, a living communion with nature, which is not romantic, you see. which brings a high seriousness and a deep tranquility, which you can never find in a romanticism. It's always all imagination, excitement, passion, strong individual color, and romantic, is an individual interpretation, an extreme form of self-expression of imagination and a personal tone. Here you find it is quite different. I think a high seriousness and a deep tranquility. Shelley had imaginative transcendentalism and a core of intellectualized imaginative vision which cannot be squared with exuberance and intense and unrestrained color usually associated with romanticism. Nor you can put Keats' worship of an ideal beauty or Byron's titanic and force of personality and call it altogether romantic. You can't. Blake's vision of the occult and subliminal and his religious symbolism, and Coleridge's sight of the supernatural with a strong strain of critical intellect carries them beyond the romantic group. And you can't put them in romantic groups, you see. The age of these poets was then followed by the Victorians and the Georgian period, both of considerable endeavor in the intellectual and artistic fields. But even great poets of this age miss the highest either by imperfect form or imperfect substance. All the artists exhibit a very narrow range in their vision. The Victorian and the Georgians, I am referring to the Victorians and the Georgians. During this epoch of imperial expansion, material prosperity, utilitarianism, application of scientific discoveries to life, well, in that period, poetry was regarded more or less an ornament. This is a period of glittering, well-turned, well-rhythmed intellectual superficialities of a thin pseudo-classicism. I'm quoting him, quoting Sherwinder. There are periods of rise and fall in literature. The Victorian age, with all its activity, is a period of depression and not of height. The modern period continues to be transitional. Intellect is the main power, and it is at work more comprehensively than before, as we saw before. Poetry, even when it takes up life motives, does not do so today for the intellectual interest in them. Does so today for intellectual interest in them. Intellect, reason, a clarity of the understanding, and arranging intelligence is not the highest power of our being. And poetry, even when it is dominated by intellectual tendency and motive, cannot really live and work by intellect alone. It is not created nor wholly shaped by reason and judgment, but it is an intuitive seeing and an inspired hearing. That is what it should become, but it is now we are trying to analyze our age, you see, the modern age. So it is natural that poetry is in the background today because these powers of vision and powers of hearing are not at work. There are other reasons why poetry cannot be what it was in the past. Two world wars have contributed to bring about a considerable psychological change in general mentality. Besides, there are many new powers at work on modern mind. The first is science. Scientific progress applied to life has brought about a revolution in transport, in mode of outer life, and in an exchange of ideas between man and man. Scientific thought, apart from pure science, as a system of philosophy has influenced modern mind considerably. This mainly consists of abstractions of reason tending to create dominant positivist outlook. The outlook tends to be positivist, scientific, materialistic, agnostic, and so on. The chief contribution of science is not creative but critical thought. The second factor is the advance in psychology by various schools laying open the subconscious, the unconscious, and other layers of human being, thus enlarging the field of experience. The third factor is the widespread ideals of social reconstruction of collective perfection based on different ideologies. The fourth factor is a powerful turn towards subjectivism in all arts. This is the most powerful factor according to Sri Aurobindo. The artist, whether a painter or a poet or a sculptor, insists on giving his own interpretation of experience, his own reaction to life, rendering off the cosmos as he feels it or sees it. As a result of these factors, there has been a large comprehensive awakening of the intellect everywhere. Our intellect is more informed, clear, and has far wider curiosity than that of men in the past. It is more ready to take up the adventure of new discovery today than it was at any other time. Consequently, it is almost certain that it can neither adopt successfully the classical form nor take to the romantic way in its poetic expression. It is too crowded, too brooding, sensitive, and responsive to many things. Both classicism and romanticism would be for it an affectation, an intellectual pose, quite unconvincing and apparently false. Well, I think we come to a stop there. Quite enough. Thing to go upon in poetry.
You said that the poetry can retrogress.
Yes.
Poetry can retrogress. Then does that also imply that humanity too may retrogress in the spiritual?
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because poetry, humanity does not live by aesthetic activity alone. Humanity, of course, it would indicate some possibility of a retrogression, but it would not necessarily follow because humanity is concerned with life. And if life takes a turn towards spirituality, well, poets can take care of themselves for one generation or two generations. They will have to come back.
But you said if life takes a turn towards
Yes,
spirituality.
yes, that's it. That's it. Yes, yes, yes. There are other indications. We have not yet taken the future poetry fully. We are only just beginning of the subject matter. You will see how he looks at even poetic creation, in which men like Wordsworth, Walt Whitman and his creation, how much of insistence on life you can see in it. It's not merely an inspiration or a vision of spirit, human spirit, humanity, really speaking. That's what he says, is it not? The modern man I sing, is it not? I sing the song democratic. The modern man I sing. Now, this is a song of humanity. So that is large, his canvas is large for his vision is large of the canvas, of the whole human race. Collective spirit, or you can say the cosmic spirit, in fact. But his insistence is on life at the same time. It's not as if, he was only wanting to fly to some region where he could, feel the vastness of the spirit and so on. What he feels is that he wants to bring it down to life. And this insistence on double aspect of the spirit as a transcendent reality based on earth and life as a term for its expression is a new tone, and that is exactly what he wants to point out. That points to the thing that must come. Well, if lesser people have followed Whitman, it's not Whitman's fault. And if small people are pygmy people, well, they will have one generation to themselves. We can't force it. But if a creator comes, as we know that in between there are not only anybody, there is Sri Aurobindo. So you see, it is somebody who carries forward. You see, so no fear of anything fall, even in poetry. Even in poetry. See, the poetic creation is not confined to half a dozen fellows who write about, three flies on the ceiling and Jane tall as a crane. You see, it's not confined to that. And the carriage in the tooth of the beloved. You see, and they're busy with that sort of thing. It's all right.
I was thinking more in terms of humanity.
Yes, but I think that there is absolutely no chance of that sort of retrogression, even in poetry.
You recall a magnificent poems of Hart Crane, a young man who died, I think he was used.
Yes, Crane's, Crane, Crab's Crane, no? He wrote on Crane.
Is, oh, just brilliant. Marvelous English. He wrote for the city, and he wrote of the themes of the city life and the bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge, chose as a symbol. Well, of course, he lived this life. I mean, he never lived long enough to even get inside.
Yeah, that was the tragedy of Shelley's life. That Shelley and Keats could not rise to ripeness of expression because they were cut off in young age. Keats might have written a great epic. One never knows. Shelley might have created much more, richly if he had life given to him. 30. It's not an age for ripeness, you see. But what was given is sufficient promise to show the spirit of man and what it can express and see in poetry. How far it can make other people see, not merely imagine. Yes, it makes you see the spirit in man, or see the vastness. The same that Whitman is able to also to perform that miracle. You see, he makes you see the human spirit. You see, in spite of his want of form and the power of aesthetic, justification, but the force is so great that you are not struck by the form only. And of course, if his form was adequate, mind, it would have been something unique, something tremendous.
I'm waiting to see if all of this vast field of scientific experimentation and knowledge, there can be some symbol within that man can see upon for good poetry. I mean,
well, you didn't see the last poem in which he writes about the atom?
Yes, I did, but I mean, that's a great.
So you see, it depends on the poet. It's the power of the poet that is required. You see, he has written on the atom already. He has written.
But that is comparatively new. We're not used to these abstract things that are so far removed from our actual life experience. Nobody yet has written a great poem on the explosion of the atom in space. I don't think, not least with the stature of Whitman.
You see, the thing is that it's not the event that is important. Its significance is important. You will not get a great epic on the Second World War. And the Greek city people fighting only little gods, well, they gave you an epic for the age and for the whole humanity. So, no, you can't have, because the spirit is not there. The Greek had the spirit. It is not the size of the event that give you an epic. It is not the material size. 1,500 miles of front was there in the last war. And still you can't have an epic because the motives which were working were not of the grandeur of man and his sublimity. You can't. Yes, that's why. That's why you have it. That's all. It is not possible. It is only possible a small thing you take, a small incident, and if it is filled with significance of the inner life, well, it gives rise to an epic. Two fellows fighting, Greek and yes, I mean the Greeks and the Trojans. What small tribes? I mean, you can't compare it with the modern war. I mean, you can't even think how small was the proportion. It was not what happened, how men looked at it, what meaning was given to it by men, what significance they attached to it. You see, that is the difference between epic spirit and practical life. And that's why joke of it I used to tell somebody. So you see, the Ramayana moves around the elopement of Sita by Ravan. Ravan takes away Sita from the forest, and Ram has to go to Ceylon fight a great battle, which is Ramayana, one of the greatest battles in Indian epical history, and win back Sita and bring her back to Ayodhya. Well, that's all that it is. So this Ramayana is a big thing, and it goes the whole, the landscape of Indian life and family and royalty and government and laws and religion and morality and husband and wife and brother and father and mother and sister and it is a world, complete world in itself. But it takes 4 months to finish Ramayana every day 1 hour, not less than 4 months. So in India they repeat like that. In the monsoon there is a katha. The epic is read out to a group. Generally a religious man asks somebody to come and repeat. And people come freely and hear. There is no charge. That's how Indian culture lived in spite of poverty, you see. If you are rich, what you do is ask somebody to come and do it for 4 months, read the Ramayana. Everybody in the neighborhood knows there is Rama and they come. There is nothing to be given. They have to simply come if they want to come. Time is fixed so that all can come. Evening time after 7:30 or 8 to 10 at night. So you see crowd sitting. That is now not so current as it was when I was a boy. You see? Whole street filled with people sitting, 2,000 people, 3,000 people at 3, 4 points in a city, hearing Rama and some reading Mahabharata and so on. That keeps the values of life alive. You see, that influences life. Well, that was the living force of the epics. But I was trying to refer that a Mohammedan was living nearby. A quarter. You see, Hindu and Mohammedan are mixed. So some Mohammedan came one day to his friend and said, "What is this going on every day, 4 months? Tan, 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 tan." He will sound some rhythmic movement and then repeat Ramayana and then explain in Indian language. Say, "What is this?" I say, Ramayana. But what is this Ramayana? Say, there is nothing. There was one fellow called Ram, another fellow called Ravan. This Ravan fellow took away this Ram's wife, and this Ram had to go and fight and kill that fellow and bring back his wife. What? This is Ramayana. It is not. Exactly, it is not. That day you see cases every day reported in the papers, isn't it? Somebody's murder or somebody's elopement or somebody's divorce. What is that? The fact is not important. The significance which is lived through or given to it and made into an active value of life, that is the epic content, you see. And in the last war, because that was left, you can't get. When people fight with low motives, you see, even a very big battle, it means nothing. It only low values are at work.
Well, would you say that,
see, so
science, pure science, is a low motive?
No, pure science is pure. That's all right. But how man looks at it and what he uses, what does he do with it?
It's too abstract.
Even pure science today is pursued by very few persons. Pure for science for its own sake. 5% of scientists are pure scientists in the sense that they want to know what is matter and they want to understand process of matter. Everybody is engaged by their government or a commercial concern or some big, syndicate to say, please find out this so that we can either have more money or produce cheaply or kill somebody. That's all. That's all that they want to do. So they poor fellows, even their scientific talent is yoked to these purposes. They might not be wanting to do it for themselves, but that is where it is. There was only 1 or 2 scientists in the world who have refused, and that is C. V. Raman in India. The India government wanted him to take up atom physics. No, I don't believe in it because it is harmful to man. That's a scientist. That's a real scientist. He said this should not be done. If there is fear and danger to mankind, we should stop it. Finish. Be done with it. Why do you want to do it? He refused. And he would have a big post and a big laboratory. He said no. He doesn't interest himself in that. He said that's wrong. If you believe that that is not good, well, why do you want to do it? Or the scientists must say, we are not going to do what the government says. We will only pursue our own scientific discoveries and keep it to ourselves. We are not going to give it to you. That's another way, yes. They can say, we will pursue science for its own sake. We will not allow you to apply it to any of your purposes. That is another independent movement possible. How many have the courage and if they do it, what chance have they to have the laboratory? It will cost some millions, isn't it, today? Poor scientists cannot have a laboratory unless there is a university or a government at its back.
Well, I still think the release of the energy of the atom, though, was the biggest thing that's happened to make man search his own
Of course,
soul and
that is true.
source.
That is a sanction behind it. That's why it has happened. It is not a something that has happened outside the sanction of the divine force that is at work. It is necessary, therefore it has come, and it is good that it has come in one sense. Only man has now to wake up to the need of finding out how to raise himself to a position or a plane of consciousness where he can use it for good. That's all. The whole conscience will have to rise. It's not one man now. It's not one man's business. You see, the masses will have to rise to an appreciation of situation by forcing their governments or their constitutions to see that man must become more than what he is up till now. He must feel himself wider, greater, and
Do or die too. It's
Huh?
almost do or die too.
Yes,
It's time to go forth.
power is not given. That the boy was telling me. I said, don't be frightened. You and I are still alive, and there is somebody who will see to it. If life is necessary, it will go on. Don't worry. He was telling the atom bomb will destroy. Atom bomb is not omnipotent, I said. Atom bomb is not omnipotent. It will not burst out of itself. Somebody will control it. Don't worry. We are not in a world where everybody is only left free to destroy the world.
Yeah.
It's not so simple as it looks.
But it brings that pressure. It brings that pressure.
Yeah, it's not good to have that fear. What I want is that there should be no fear. There should be a calm mind and a firm decision that man will have to rise to a plane where he can control this thing. That's all. If you do fear, you sometimes in panic, you do just the opposite thing that you should do. That's what I told my friend, that fear is like a vacuum, and it always pulls the thing that it wants to avoid. It simply will pull the thing back, you see. In fear, you go back into yourself, and the thing that you are avoiding is pursuing you in the vacuum. Shouldn't do it.
Say that again.
Well, fear creates a psychological vacuum in which the very thing you fear, well, has the greatest chance of happening.
Science. They're not alive to the emotional light of man, you know?
Yes, look at
That
that.
makes it difficult for us to create poetry, to be inspired in them, I think.
Not merely that, you see. Even science can be used.
It can be.
I will give you instance. We are coming to it, third or fourth lecture, I don't know when. It will come. I'll show you how even an aeroplane can be used, has been
Yeah.
used.
I've seen beautiful poetry written in the last, I was
Yes.
on following home to library of unknown poets.
Dullest incidents of life, for instance, the coming down of an aeroplane or a encounter between a small Portuguese, I think, Iberian naval unit and a German cruiser, in which the Iberian naval unit was destroyed, completely killed. It is very beautiful, almost, fine poetry out of it. Beautiful poetry. C.D. Lewis has written Nabara, Fall of the Nabara. It's a wonderful poem. Also, Flight to Australia. I think Peter, yes, Ferrer and Mackintosh, two people, after the First World War,
Yes.
taking a condemned aeroplane to Australia. You find there. See, he takes the thing, engine, magneto, and everything, how it falls and what happens and so on. And yet it is beautiful poetry and high poetry. Absolutely high. Only you have no time to go into all those details, you see. Someday I might write a small book on modern poetry, then you might see about 110 pages.
What do you think of Robert Frost?
his favorite in her.
Robert Frost, I have not read much of his works. He is more a critic, is it? I don't know.
Farm,
American poet.
nature poet,
Yes.
mostly.
Huh?
He's a nature poet, but he
Ah,
always has
yeah.
universal.
Yes, yes, yes. He has written something about C.D. Lewis, I think.
And he's very up and running poet.
Yes, yes, he's a good writer.
With other
Mhm.
mythology and modern poetry.
Poet begins with this and ends in wisdom. That is his sentence, I think. Robert Frost.
Begins before.
Oh. I just get out of my mind somewhere. Let me see if I got down somewhere. A poet begins with something, yes, it is like that. It's not poetry. Mhm. A poem begins, it is like that. You see. Mhm.
Yeah, I think.
Archibald MacLeish, you think me?
I'll bring you along.
I have got that. Somewhere I have got it down. I know. Robert
You
Frost.
familiar with Archibald MacLeish?
Hmm?
Okay,
Hmm?
Archibald MacLeish, are you familiar with his poetry?
No.
He's an American
Hmm.
poetry.
I don't know, we have to cut short because we have to limit our scope, and that is a difficulty. How to limit the scope? The subject is so wide.
Well, I just thought I might try to get Marilyn Wetmore to come if there were going to be more on poetry because she's a poet.
Three. Hmm?
Did you say that you hadn't finished Divine Life, that you had a lecture?
Yes, yes, one or two.
Maybe you could get one of those before we move on to that. Of course, that's.
That I don't know. No,
Yeah, tomorrow's the last day we'll be here.
no, I think that won't be possible. Right, even we have to postpone for some time, but about this poetry, I don't know. We might have three more talks on poetry, but I'll try to cover, but it's difficult to cover the ground. You see, three more. This is one, and then the conditions of future poetry, when the trend that he lays down for the reading of it, then the necessary elements that would be required in the future poetry or would act in future poetry, and the evaluation of some of the modern writers, C.T.S. Eliot and C.D. Lewis and Herbert Reed and Siegfried Sassoon and so on, like that 4 or 5. We take like that 5 or 6 names and try to see how his reading of the future has found expression in this latest poetic expression. You see, the elements are present, that's all. Some of the elements, I won't say all. And then he himself is, of course, the towering example of what he wants to say. That is there, share. And those contributions like that, a huge affair. But even in those people who have not been conscious at it and so on, even in them, how you can see that very, very clearly. I would time. We have to create more time.
What are we having tonight?
Well, I think this human cycle, perhaps.